early church fathers interpreted Christ's dictum to render unto God what belongs to God and unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar as marking a departure in human society. Never again, they said, could the same person simultaneously wield ultimate political authority and ultimate religious authority. The priest and the king are distinct offices. They can never be united in the same person. And this became an essential part of Christian faith, the distinction between religion and government, between God and Caesar, between church and state, was considered an essential element of Christian faith from the very beginning. The earliest church fathers discussed this, and it continues to the present day. It has never changed, and no one has ever theoretically, within under the umbrella of Christianity, no one has denied that. It is a staple of our thought, one that we take for granted to this very day. But its origin was right back here at this early period of Christianity, where, as I said, the early church fathers interpreted Christ's dictum as demanding a distinction between these two, we should call them jurisdictions. There's one society, but within society there are two orders. There's the order of God, the church, and the order of Caesar, the secular state. And they each have distinct and defined realms or tasks, but they're not the same, and they should not be commingled or confused together. All right, now all Christians believe this, including in the Orthodox Church in the East. But the problem was, in the East, the church was never able to make this distinction between God and Caesar functional or actually institutionalized because the Roman emperors there carried on in the East the ancient pagan tradition of political control of religion, regarding them as united in one person. And what developed in the East is a peculiar form of church-state relations that are known as Caesaro-papism. Caesar from secular rulers, papism from the church fathers. So Caesaro-papism is a form of church-state relations that might be summarized as saying the state controls everything, including religion, passes on its dictums to the church, and the church then impresses them downward across the population. So as a result of this, the church always being more or less involved under political control in the East, the church was never able to stand up as an autonomous, independent authority capable of challenging the political rulers. It never became autonomous, independent of the state. The church was dependent on the government for finances, for appointments in its hierarchy, and all kinds of other things. And so it never became, as I said, a countervailing power that was capable of standing up to the political rulers and forcing or impressing upon them a Christian understanding of correct political rule. So as a result, the institutions of freedom did not emerge in the East. We shall see that in the West, it was precisely this issue, the fortunate historical circumstances enabled eventually, and it took many centuries, the Latin Church to become an independent spiritual authority that held the respect of the people in such a way that it had moral authority, and it was able to be an independent spiritual authority capable of standing up to the secular rulers and imposing Christian values on them and limiting the power of the secular rulers. This didn't happen overnight, and this distinction between God and Caesar, between religion and government, even though no one ever denied it in theory, in practice it was often violated. The separation as we call it, between church and state can be violated in one of two ways. Either the political authorities can overstep their legitimate boundaries and start trying to control the religious and spiritual life of people, or the opposite can and has happened. The church authorities can overstep their boundaries and start to act like political rulers, using the coercive force of political rule to enforce a Christian understanding of things. Depending on the historical period, both have happened. In the earliest years that we're talking about here, the Dark Ages and the early Middle Ages, the problem was the political control of religion. If we had more time, I would go into it, but during these years, what develops in the West is a peculiar form of economic political arrangement called feudalism. And in order to sustain their power, the feudal lords often tried to appoint the bishops in the church to put their own friends and warriors and supporters into influential positions within the church, such as the bishops, choosing who the bishops were and investing them with their authority, spiritual authority, and so forth. As you can imagine, such a practice over time led to tremendous corruption within the church. It's pretty doubtful that the feudal warriors were really the people of the greatest spiritual integrity. And so by the 9th century, there was already a kind of crisis. If you were a Christian who was worried about the corruption of Christ's message by this, by feudal warriors leading the church, and you wanted to maintain a pure form of Christianity, what you would probably do at the time was join a monastery. This is the era when the Christian monasteries took on a very important cultural role. So you would join a monastery. So the monasteries became centers, hotbeds of resistance, of people who were really disturbed by the ongoing corruption of the church. In the late 1000s, one of these monks coming out of Cluny, France, was elected Pope. This is Gregory VII. And he recognized that in order to stop this corruption of the church, the first thing that had to happen was you had to stop these political leaders from appointing the church hierarchy, appointing the bishops. This led him into a gigantic controversy with the emperor of the day. And so the Pope said to the Emperor Henry, you must stop appointing bishops in the church. It's called the investiture controversy. Investiture was when a priest is invested with the authority of a bishop. It's a spiritual sort of sacramental activity. But anyway, the Pope said to the emperor, no, you must stop doing this because it's destroying and corrupting the church. And the king, well, he said, no, I'm not going to stop, because he didn't want to stop, because that meant his own power and authority would be undermined. Because remember, the kings and princes and so forth were used to appointing bishops in the church, and they would put their own pals in there, so they had guaranteed support among the church hierarchy. So Henry would have undermined his own authority and power by doing that, so he refused. He said, no, I'm not going to stop. Well, a huge controversy arose. People in society took either side, either the side of the papacy or the side of the empire. We have a big literature on this period, but eventually it led to what is sometimes called the Papal Revolution. The church was victorious in this battle. Their banner was freedom of the church, that is, freedom from political control. And they won, more or less. Henry agreed to stop appointing bishops in the church, but he reserved the right to veto the list of nominees. So there was a kind of compromise at the Concordat of Worms in 1122. But the bottom line is that the church in the West, unlike the Christian church in the East, managed to free itself from political control by the 11th century. The next couple centuries, 12th, 13th, are really sometimes called the Age of Faith. These were the centuries in which Christianity was able to so deeply impress the consciousness of the inhabitants of the Western territories that by this period, certainly by the 11th and 12th century, this civilization that emerged in the territories of the Western Roman Empire began to understand itself as Christendom. This civilization we live in is Christendom. And everyone in the world thought the same thing. There was the Islamic world, the world of China and Confucianism, and the Hindu civilization. The Western territories were regarded as Christendom. This was the territory where everybody was a Christian. Everybody understood that. And Western civilization was called Christendom all the way up until the 19th and even into the 20th century. And there's no reason why it still shouldn't be. Because Western civilization received its definitive shape and character from the all-important influence of the Christian church, of the Latin church in the West. The church had real authority because it was now viewed as an independent authority, independent of political control. It was not tarred by the idea that religion was just a tool of politics, but rather an independent voice of truth. And so we see in these centuries, 12th, 13th, the high civilization of the Middle East comes into bloom. Universities were founded, tremendous intellectual activity and scholarship, say among the scholastics, Thomas Aquinas and so forth. The Christianity sort of turned the tables on the Caesaropapism of the East. Remember, we said the Caesaropapism was when the political authorities powerfully influence religion, if not outright control it. In the West, the exact opposite happened. The church authorities were victorious. They became the higher authority, and they were able to impress biblical vision on the political sphere. And this is the era in which we begin to see, well, there were limits on government. As the church said, the king is under God and under law. Everybody is under God's law, and everyone is expected to act according to Christian moral precepts, whether you're the garbage man or the king. It doesn't matter. So Christianity moralized the political dimension because it became an autonomous voice of spiritual truth. So now why is that important? And again, many scholars have said that this is probably the single most important contribution of Christianity to the development of the free society. And why would that be? Because think what it would mean if we did not have a conception of society as constituted by these two orders. There's the religious and spiritual dimension, and then there's the political dimension. They are related, but they are distinct. For example, I'm just going to throw out a couple dichotomies that I'm pretty sure all of you will comprehend. Does anybody here think, do any of you think that religion and government are the same thing? Church and state the same thing? The inner conscience the same thing as external actions? That the moral is identical with the legal, or that sin and crime are identical? No, and we could go on. There are further dichotomies. What the medievals called it the spiritual dimension of existence versus the temporal dimension restricted to this world. No, these dichotomies we still have to this day. Not every sin is a crime, and not every crime is a sin. What is moral is not necessarily legal, and what is legal is not necessarily moral. They might be, but they're not necessarily so because they are distinct concepts. One falls under the rubric of God, and the other falls under the rubric of Caesar, the category. What this did was free up an entire dimension of existence, the spiritual dimension, the realm of the inner man, of conscience, of eternity, of salvation, of morality, of sin, off limits to government. Government has its own jurisdiction, and it's important, but it is limited to worldly affairs that deal with the overarching preservation of society in this world. It is not to interfere in the spiritual life of man. This is the origin of what we call limited government. And it is, freedom is the other side of the concept of limited government, as we've seen. Government is coercion, it is force, and it is limited in the interest of protecting freedom and other natural rights. So this is why the quest for freedom emerges in Europe, because Europe was shaped by Christianity. European civilization is Christendom, and the quest for freedom is centered right here, in large part because of this Christian distinction between the separation of church and state. Because if you unite them together in the same hands, if government is entitled to rule all of life, including the spiritual dimension as well as the worldly dimension, that's just another word for total control over society, or totalitarianism. And as we've seen, totalitarianism is unlimited government, and its opposite is what our tradition of limited government. And it's this important distinction between church and state that is at the root of it. So much so that in the 5th century, one of the popes of the era, Pope Gelasius, articulated what became classic Christian understanding. He articulated what's called the two powers or the two swords doctrine. He says 2 powers there are by which this world is governed: the spiritual authority of the church, the spiritual power of the church, and the secular power of the king. And then he goes on to say, and of these 2 powers, the spiritual power is superior, because priests have to answer to God for the souls of kings themselves. This is central to the distinctiveness of Western civilization, because you can search the world today, anywhere you want to go. And the only places where you're going to find people who understand this distinction between God and Caesar, between church and state, are people who have been influenced by Christianity. It's not found anywhere else, in any other religion or any other culture or any other kind of political system. If you were all from fundamentalist Islamic countries, you wouldn't know what I'm talking about, right? They have the opposite of separation of church and state is usually called a theocracy, where religion and government are unified in one system and one authority. For example, in a fundamentalist Islamic state, the police, the regular secular police, also enforce the Quran, right? There's no distinction made. It would be as if our police were charged with enforcing the Bible, right? I don't think many of us think that would be appropriate, and so forth. So when we're looking for the quest for freedom, we know the answer. It's Europe, and Europe was the nursery of freedom as we know it. And so there is a distinct correlation between Europe, Christianity, and freedom for this reason. So our quest for freedom, we know the answer. Now we're going to end this little session for now. I'm going to come back and then we're going to talk about why this is, what is there in Christianity, apart from its separation of church and state, that led to the demand and the quest for freedom in the West. Now, I'm assuming most of you, most of our students in this class are Christian. So you might do a little meditation on that on your own, because it should be, something should come to mind to see it's not surprising that Christianity would lead to the free society. And actually still to this day is at the base of the free society. And we're also going to talk about the dangers that we are facing, given the fact that Christianity has been under attack for the past century and a half, and it is being destroyed as the spiritual foundation of our civilization and society. It's no coincidence that the free society has been undermined and is on the decline, because the free society is the other side of the biblical worldview. And so if you want to destroy a society, you must destroy its foundation. And the foundation of Western civilization, including its American expression, was the biblical worldview. And as that is progressively being undermined, the institutional structure that emerged in response to the Christian worldview is also being undermined. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. All right, see you then.